Imagine a world where your daily grind, your endless tasks, and your specialized skills were simply invisible. Time when the very foundation of society, built by tireless hands, was seen as natural, not monumental. Welcome to 800-odd paths. Were women's indispensable contributions truly valued, or were they merely expected, taken for granted in ways we can barely fathom today? Number 10. The production of necessities, from raw material to ready goods. Picture the dawn breaking over a small village in the Carolingian Empire, or perhaps an Anglo-Saxon homestead nestled by a river. The sounds beginning to stir are not just the roosters crowing or the sheep bleating. There's the low hum of dedicated effort, the rustle of straw, the clatter of earthenware. Much of this subtle symphony of creation emanated directly from the home, and it was predominantly women who orchestrated it. This was a time before factories, before supply chains as we know them, before convenience stores on every corner. Every single necessity, from the clothes on your back to the bread in your belly, had to be conjured from raw materials, a monumental process that often started and ended within the domestic sphere. Think about clothing for a moment. Today, you buy your shirt from a shop, unaware of the journey it took from cotton field to hanger. In 800, and if you wanted a new tunic, it was likely your mother, sister, or wife who brought it into existence, starting not with a pattern, but with a living animal or a planted seed. Consider the wool. Sheep had to be shorn, often a messy and physically demanding task, even if sometimes men assisted with the initial shearing. But once the fleece was off, the truly arduous work began. The raw wool was dirty, greasy, and full of burrs and vegetable matter. It needed to be meticulously cleaned, a process involving washing in hot water, often with lye or stale urine to break down the lanolin. Then came the drying, followed by the painstaking removal of every tiny piece of debris. After cleaning, the wool was ready for preparation. This involved carding or combing techniques, used to align the fibers, disentangling them, and preparing them for spinning. Carding involved two paddles with rows of wire teeth, used to brush the wool repeatedly until it formed soft, airy rolls. Combing, for longer fibers, used larger combs to create smooth, lustrous slivers. This wasn't just busy work. It required incredible dexterity and strength in the hands and arms, often for hours on end. Imagine the blisters, the aching muscles just to get the wool ready for the next stage. Historians studying domestic toolkits from early medieval archaeological sites frequently discover numerous combs and whorls, testament to the ubiquity of these preparatory steps in every household. Then came the spinning. This was perhaps one of the most iconic images of women's work in this era, and for good reason. It was constant. Whether using a drop spindle, a deceptively simple tool that required immense coordination, or eventually a spinning wheel. In later centuries, the goal was the same: to twist loose fibers into continuous threads. A single garment, even a simple tunic, could require miles of spun thread. This meant countless hours, perhaps even weeks or months, spent spinning. It was a skill often learned from a very young age, passed down from mother to daughter, requiring an almost meditative concentration. Quality of the spun thread directly impacted the quality of the final cloth, dictating its strength, its warmth, and its durability. A coarser thread might be for rough work clothes or blankets, while a finer, more even thread was destined for better garments or household linens. Chronicles from the time, like those detailing the lives of aristocratic women, often mention their engagement in spinning, highlighting that even high-status women participated, underscoring its foundational importance. Once enough thread was accumulated, it was time for dyeing. While some dyes might have been bought or traded, many households would have gathered their own dye stuffs from the surrounding environment. Woad for blues, madder for reds, weld for yellows, bark and leaves for greens and browns. Preparing these dyes was another complex process, often involving boiling, fermentation, and mordants to fix the color. Then came the careful dipping and redipping of the spun threads, ensuring an even, lasting color. This required knowledge of plants, chemistry, and precise timing. Finally, the weaving. This was the truly Druidic stage, turning individual threads into a continuous piece of cloth. Looms in this period varied, from simple, warp-weighted looms to horizontal ground looms. Operating a loom was a skilled craft, demanding physical endurance to operate the heddles and throw the shuttle, and mental acuity to maintain the pattern and tension. A loom could be large and cumbersome, taking up significant space within the home. Weaving a standard length of cloth for a garment or blanket could take days or even weeks, depending on the complexity of the weave and the size of the piece. The rhythmic clack of the loom would have been a constant backdrop in many homes. A testament to this incredible output, archaeologists have found evidence of loom weights and remnants of ancient looms across European settlements of 800 AD, strongly suggesting that this process was almost universally conducted in the domestic sphere. After the weaving, the cloth was still not a garment. It needed to be cut and sewn. This involved pattern creation, careful measurement, and painstaking needlework. Seams had to be strong and durable, especially for clothing that would endure daily wear and tear in an often harsh environment. Needles were made of bone, bronze, or iron, and thread was made from linen, wool, or sometimes even plant fibers. The creation of garments, from simple tunics and leggings to more complex cloaks and dresses, was an entirely manual process, demanding precision and hours of diligent effort. This intense process wasn't just for clothing. Think about food. While men might have plowed fields and harvested grain, women were largely responsible for turning that raw grain into sustenance. This involved winnowing the grain, often beating it to separate the kernels from the chaff, then grinding it into flour, usually using a quern, a laborious process of turning heavy stones by hand for hours. Then came the baking of bread, the staple of the medieval diet requiring knowledge of yeasts, fermentation, and temperature control in often rudimentary ovens or over open fires. Beyond bread, there was the preservation of food for winter, drying fruits and vegetables, salting meats, making cheeses, brewing ale or mead. Each of these activities was a complex culinary science, demanding specific skills, knowledge of seasons, and tireless effort. The sheer volume of this work, the continuous transformation of raw earth-given materials into usable, life-sustaining goods, was immense. It was the bedrock of household survival and the foundation of community life. Yet it was so deeply embedded in the domestic sphere that its economic value and inherent skill were often entirely overlooked, simply taken for granted as a woman's lot. Number 9. The health keepers, sanitation and well-being. Consider a time when the very concept of germs was utterly unknown, when illness was often attributed to divine wrath or bad humors, and medical knowledge was rudimentary at best. In this world of 800 AD, preventing sickness and nurturing health within the home fell heavily, almost entirely, on women. Their daily, often unseen labor was the first, and often only, line of defense against disease and discomfort, a vital contribution to the well-being and survival of the family that was rarely, if ever, acknowledged as skilled work. This wasn't just about making someone comfortable when they were sick. It was about the constant, grueling effort to prevent sickness in the first place, and to manage it when it inevitably arrived. Think about the sheer amount of water management required. Without indoor plumbing, every drop of water for drinking, cooking, washing, and cleaning had to be carried into the home, from a well, a stream, or a spring. This was physically demanding, often done multiple times a day. Women were the primary water carriers, often balancing heavy buckets or ceramic vessels, traversing uneven terrain. And it wasn't just about bringing the water in. It was about managing its use. Water was a precious commodity, but cleanliness was also paramount. Women were responsible for ensuring that drinking water was as clean as possible, often by drawing it from the purest source available, or, if possible, boiling it for food preparation, though the understanding of why this helped was absent. The disposal of one wound was equally important to prevent the buildup of stagnant disease-breeding conditions. Then there was the constant battle against filth and pests. Homes in 800 AD were often small, smoky, and shared with animals. In some instances, keeping them clean was an endless chore. Floors, often earthen, needed to be swept, sometimes regularly sprinkled with fresh rushes or herbs to absorb spills and mask odors. Walls might need scrubbing. Cooking surfaces and utensils, often made of wood or unglazed pottery, needed to be scoured to prevent the buildup of food residues that could harbor spoilage. The hearth, the center of domestic life, required constant attention, clearing ash, maintaining the fire, and ensuring good ventilation to prevent smoke inhalation, a significant health hazard in its own right. Archaeological excavations of domestic sites from the early medieval period consistently show hearths and associated cooking implements, underscoring the central role of fire management and cleanliness in daily life. Food preparation, as mentioned, was also a health imperative. It wasn't just about grinding grain. It was about preventing food spoilage in an era without refrigeration. Women possessed vast traditional knowledge about drying, salting, smoking, and fermenting food to preserve it safely through lean seasons. They had to know which mushrooms were edible and which were poisonous, which berries could be gathered, and which herbs held medicinal properties. This practical knowledge, accumulated over generations and passed down orally, was critical for preventing widespread food poisoning and ensuring adequate nutrition. Without this constant vigilance, families would face not just hunger, but potentially deadly illness. Records from later medieval periods, which might reflect practices from 800 AD, indicate specific duties assigned to women regarding dairy production and food preservation, tacitly acknowledging this critical role. Beyond prevention, women were also the primary caregivers for the sick and infirm. When someone fell ill, it was the woman of the house who became the nurse, the healer, and the comforter. This involved administering traditional remedies, often based on herbs and plants known for their medicinal properties, sometimes involving poultices or brews. It meant sitting up through the night, tending to fevers, cleaning wounds, and providing comfort. Childbirth, a highly dangerous event in this period, was almost exclusively managed by women, with skilled midwives often leading the process. After birth, the care of infants and young children, who were highly susceptible to illness, was entirely within the domestic sphere. This involved meticulous hygiene, appropriate feeding, and constant monitoring, crucial for survival rates in a time of high infant mortality. The ability to distinguish symptoms, apply remedies, and nurse patients back to health was a specialized skill set requiring observation, experience, and resilience. Consider the disposal of human waste. While some larger settlements might have had rudimentary latrines, in most rural homes, it was a constant challenge. Women often managed the disposal of chamber pot contents, ensuring they were taken far enough away from the living quarters and water sources to prevent contamination. This was a dirty, unpleasant, but absolutely essential task for preventing the spread of diseases. The meticulous attention to details of bodily hygiene, from washing clothes to ensuring the cleanliness of bedding, also fell to women. While public bathing was less common than in Roman times, individual hygiene was still maintained to the best of their abilities within the home. The sum of these tasks was immense: the constant fetching and managing of water, the unending cleaning of the living space, the careful preservation and preparation of food, and the continuous care for the sick and young. These were not considered professional or skilled tasks in the way that a blacksmith's or a carpenter's work might be. They were simply part of a woman's expected duties, deeply ingrained into the societal fabric. Yet, their impact on the health, comfort, and sheer survival of the family and community was profound. Without this tireless vigilance and practical expertise, communities would have been far more vulnerable to disease and far less resilient in the face of widespread illness, underscoring a vast, often unacknowledged contribution to public health that was performed entirely within the confines of the home. Number 8. The uncounted contributions. Absence from public records. Imagine living in a society where your immense daily efforts, your tireless production, and your crucial contributions to the very survival of your family and community were simply never written down. In 800, for the vast majority of women engaged in domestic work, this was the stark reality. While male economic activities, legal standings, and military service might find their way into charters, land deeds, tax records, or chronicles, the daily essential labor of women in the home was almost entirely absent from the public documents of the era. This silence in the historical record isn't just an oversight. It actively contributed to the undervaluing of their work, rendering it virtually invisible to posterity and often to contemporary society. Consider the official records of the Carolingian Empire, a dominant force in Europe at this time. Documents like the Capitular de Villiers, which detailed the management of royal estates, meticulously listed resources, livestock, and the duties of various male laborers, plowmen, shepherds, blacksmiths. While it might mention the number of women on an estate, it rarely, if ever, elaborated on the specific nature, quantity, or value of their domestic contributions. The work of spinning, weaving, food preservation, cheese-making, brewing, and childcare, all of which were economically vital to the estate's self-sufficiency, were largely unquantified in these administrative directives. They were simply assumed part of the background hum of the estate's operation, rather than a recognized component of its productive output. Historians, relying on these texts for economic insights into the period, often face a challenge in reconstructing the full scope of labor because a significant portion of it performed by women simply wasn't deemed worthy of explicit notation. Even in legal documents, like wills or property transfers, while women might be named as beneficiaries or property holders in certain circumstances, their domestic labor itself was rarely assigned a specific monetary value. If a woman brought wealth to a marriage, it was typically in the form of land or goods, not as a valuation of her skilled household management or her productive capacity in creating essential goods. Her output was considered part of the use of the household, not a distinct economic contribution separate from the male head of household. Think about the chroniclers and monastic scribes who meticulously recorded events of their time. Their focus was largely on the lives of kings, bishops, battles, and the founding of monasteries. While they occasionally mention queens or abbesses in their roles within powerful institutions, the everyday lives and labor of ordinary women in the home were almost completely ignored. These narratives, which form much of our written historical understanding of 800, present the world largely devoid of the specific tangible details of women's work. Creation of garments, the preparation of meals, the nursing of the sick, these were not considered grand enough or public enough to merit a place in the written annals of the time. This lack of documentation implies a lack of recognition, suggesting that these labors were so deeply embedded in the natural order of things that they didn't even warrant description. Even in more intimate family records, where they exist, the emphasis tends to be on lineages, births, deaths, and property, rather than a detailed accounting of daily labor. The expectation was that women would perform these tasks, making their efforts part of the unspoken contract of domestic life, rather than a subject for explicit record-keeping. This stands in stark contrast to the way men's specialized crafts, like that of a carpenter, a blacksmith, or a shoemaker, would generate tangible output that could be bought, sold, and therefore recorded in transactions or contracts. The domestic output of women was consumed within the household, often without ever entering a formal market economy, further contributing to its unrecorded status. The archaeological record offers a fascinating counterpoint, providing material evidence of women's pervasive domestic activities. Excavations regularly uncover spindle, whorls, loom weights, quernstones for grinding grain, cooking pots, and other tools directly linked to the tasks performed by women in the home. These artifacts speak volumes about the sheer volume and centrality of women's productive labor. Yet these physical remnants stand in stark contrast to the almost complete silence of the written record. It's as if a huge, bustling, productive part of society existed, but no one felt the need to write it down because it was simply considered the background of life, not the foreground of history. This absence from public records had profound implications. It meant that women's work was not accounted for in assessments of wealth, power, or economic contribution. It made it harder for individual women to assert a claim over their labor or its products, contributed to a societal understanding that women's work was merely supportive rather than foundational. And for us, looking back from centuries later, it creates a significant challenge in fully appreciating the scale and complexity of women's historical contributions. The quiet, tireless hands that spun the thread, baked the bread, and tended the sick were the unwritten pillars of 800 AD society. Their immense efforts largely unrecorded and therefore often undervalued. Number 7. The natural role. Biology as destiny. Imagine a societal belief so deeply ingrained that it shapes every expectation, every duty, and every perceived value, making a whole category of work seem less like skilled labor and more like an inherent, unchangeable facet of existence. In 800, this was the pervasive notion that women's primary role, and thus their work, was natural and intrinsically tied to their biological capacity to bear children and nurture life. This powerful idea served to diminish the recognition of their domestic contributions as demanding, skilled, or economically significant labor, framing it instead as an almost instinctual extension of their female identity. This deeply held belief wasn't just a casual observation. It was often reinforced by prevailing religious, philosophical, and social doctrines of the time. While direct theological treatises from 800 AD specifically on women's domestic labor are rare, the broader Christian worldview, which was rapidly spreading and consolidating influence across Europe, heavily emphasized women's roles as mothers and homemakers, often drawing from biblical narratives. This spiritual and moral framing elevated the domestic sphere as the proper and pious domain for women, implicitly suggesting that their activities within it were not a matter of choice or skill, but a divinely ordained purpose. The very act of caring for the home and children was seen as fulfilling a natural order, rather than a demanding, economically productive profession. Because domestic work was seen as a natural female duty, it often went unremarked upon and unrewarded in the same way that male-dominated professions might be. A man who was a skilled carpenter or a brave warrior was lauded for his learned abilities and actions. A woman who tirelessly managed a household, processed raw materials into goods, and nurtured multiple children to adulthood was simply fulfilling her natural role. There was no formal training for this role because it was considered innate. While daughters certainly learned practical skills from their mothers, this informal apprenticeship was not recognized or celebrated in the same way as a male apprenticeship in a trade, which often involved formal agreements and eventual entry into a recognized guild or craft. The natural framing bypassed the concept of acquired skill, making the work appear effortless despite the immense effort and expertise actually required. This perception meant that the challenges and complexities of domestic work were often overlooked. The biological reality of childbirth, nursing, and childcare was undeniable, but the leap was often made to assume that all activities within the domestic sphere, no matter how unrelated to direct biological functions, were simply extensions of this natural capacity. So, turning raw wool into durable woolen goods, or managing a household's food supply through harsh winters, or providing comprehensive health care for an entire family without modern medicine, were all bundled under the umbrella of what women naturally do. This blurred the lines between biological imperative and learned, arduous labor. Consider the physical demands. While men might engage in heavy labor in the fields or in battle, women's natural domestic duties were often equally, if not more physically, grueling, though often in different ways. Hauling water, grinding grain for hours, kneeling to scour floors, the constant bending and lifting associated with childcare, the repetitive motions of spinning and weaving, these tasks demanded immense stamina and strength. Yet, they were not seen as work in the same vein as male physical labor, precisely because they were considered natural to women's sphere. Accounts from later medieval periods, which often reflect earlier customs, sometimes hint at the sheer physical exhaustion of women from endless household chores. Yet this was rarely framed as a societal burden or economic input, but rather as a personal endurance test inherent to their role. The concept of nature also implied an inherent suitability, suggesting that women were simply built for these tasks. This removed any element of choice or individual talent. It minimized the innovation, adaptability, and problem-solving skills that women undoubtedly applied daily to manage their households in challenging circumstances. If it's natural, it doesn't require exceptional intelligence or learned expertise. It just requires being female. This deeply entrenched worldview created a powerful barrier to recognizing and valuing women's domestic contributions as skilled, productive, and economically vital labor, instead relegating it to an assumed background function, an unremarked part of the biological and social order. This pervasive attitude ultimately ensured that the efforts of women in the home, no matter how crucial, remained undervalued, simply because they were perceived as natural. Number 6. Passed down, not professionally taught. Imagine dedicating years, even decades, to mastering a complex set of skills that are absolutely essential for your community's survival. Yet these skills are never formally recognized, never taught in schools or guilds, and never lead to a professional title or public prestige. This was the reality for women's domestic work in 800 AD. The vast wealth of knowledge and expertise required to run a household, from food preparation to textile creation, was passed down through informal apprenticeship within the home, from mother to daughter, elder to younger. This lack of formal training and recognition actively contributed to the undervaluing of these vital skills, reducing them to mere household chores rather than acknowledging them as complex, economically critical trades. In 800, if a young man wanted to learn blacksmithing, he would often be apprenticed to a master smith. He would spend years learning the craft, honing his skills, and eventually, if he proved capable, he might become a journeyman, then a master, joining a guild and gaining public recognition for his expertise. This structured path lent status and value to his work. For women, no such formal system existed for the skills of the home. There were no academies for baking, no guild halls for expert weavers, no formal certifications for proficient healers within the household. Instead, a girl would learn by observation and participation from a very young age. She would watch her mother, grandmothers, and older sisters spin, weave, cook, preserve, and tend to the sick. She would start with simple tasks like carrying water or sorting herbs, gradually progressing to more complex duties as she grew. This learning process was immersive and continuous, beginning in early childhood and extending through adolescence into adulthood. By the time a woman married and established her own household, she was expected to possess a comprehensive mastery of these diverse skills. Accounts from early medieval societies, though scarce on explicit detail regarding domestic training, implicitly suggest this multi-generational transfer of knowledge through the continued presence of domestic tools in household. This informal transmission of knowledge, while effective in perpetuating essential skills, had a significant downside. It masked the true depth and complexity of the expertise being acquired. Because it wasn't taught in a formal, structured way, it wasn't seen as professional. The skills were integrated into daily life, making them seem commonplace and inherent rather than requiring dedicated study and practice. Imagine trying to master complex processes, like cheesemaking, brewing ale, or dyeing woolen goods, using only natural ingredients and without precise measurements or written instructions. This required a vast amount of experiential knowledge, an intuitive understanding of chemistry, biology, and seasonal cycles. Yet, because it was learned within the confines of the home, it was rarely given the same respect or economic valuation as skills learned in a public workshop. Furthermore, the lack of formal teaching meant there was no public standard for these skills. While a poorly crafted shoe might be visible and criticized, a poorly spun thread or an inefficient cooking method might only affect the immediate household, rarely entering the public sphere of judgment or recognition. This internalized nature of the apprenticeship kept the value of the skills private rather than public. There were no master-level certifications for household management, no public exhibitions of the finest spun threads from domestic looms. The recognition for these skills was largely confined to the family, expressed through the well-being of the household, rather than public acclaim or economic reward. The continuous, often invisible nature of this training meant that the skill involved was often dismissed as common sense or simply women's intuition. Yet managing the entire logistical operation of a self-sufficient household, particularly in an era of scarcity and limited resources, demanded immense foresight, resourcefulness, and a practical application of a wide range of sciences, even if they weren't labeled as such. From understanding crop rotation for food security to knowing how to treat various ailments with herbal remedies, women were repositories of critical practical knowledge passed down through generations. Archaeological evidence showing differences in domestic tool quality or the prevalence of specific culinary tools implies varying levels of skill within households, suggesting that mastery was indeed a valued trait, even if not formally recognized. This informal learning system, while highly functional, ultimately deprived women's domestic labor of the external validation that formal training and professional recognition could have provided. It meant that the professions of homemaking, childcare, and subsistence production, despite being foundational to society, were largely unheralded. The women who practiced these vital arts were highly skilled, but their skills were acquired and utilized in a way that kept them largely outside the formal economy and public consciousness, contributing significantly to the pervasive undervaluing of their work. Number 5. The silent support system, enabling male work. Imagine building a magnificent structure, but your efforts are largely attributed to the architect and the visible masons, while the hidden foundations, the intricate plumbing, and the constant maintenance that makes the entire building functional are ignored. This was often the reality for women's work in 800 ad Naix, Cumber. This was often the reality for women's work in 800 AD. Their immense domestic labor, though absolutely essential for the very survival and functionality of the family unit, was frequently viewed as merely a supportive role, enabling men to perform their primary work outside the home, whether that was farming, fighting, trading, or governing. This perception fundamentally devalued women's contributions, seeing them as secondary and derivative rather than independently valuable. Consider the male farmer. His ability to plow the fields, sow the seeds, and harvest the crops was seen as the crucial productive labor that fed the family and generated wealth. But what allowed him to dedicate his time and energy to this demanding outdoor work? It was the woman at home who ensured he had cooked meals to sustain him, clean clothes to wear, and a well-managed household to return to. She processed the grain he harvested into bread, turning raw agricultural output into edible sustenance. She spun the wool from the sheep he tended into threads which were then woven into durable garments. Making use of raw materials and preventing the need to purchase finished goods, thereby saving valuable household resources. The tools he used might have been made or repaired by a blacksmith, but the vital provisioning of his daily needs, the care of his children so he could work undisturbed, and the maintenance of the household infrastructure that allowed him to rest and recuperate, all fell to the woman. Contemporary agricultural treatises, though written by men, often implicitly acknowledge the daily grind of household life, demonstrating how the stability of the home was a precondition for successful outdoor labor. The same applies to other male roles. A warrior might gain renown on the battlefield, but it was the women in his household who maintained his equipment, prepared his provisions for journeys, and ensured his family's survival in his absence. Craftsmen could spend long hours in his workshop, creating pottery or metalwork, because his domestic needs were met by his wife. She might even be involved in aspects of his trade, perhaps preparing materials, handling local sales, or managing accounts. Yet her direct contribution to the craft was often unacknowledged beyond the domestic sphere. The economic output of the male worker was visible and quantifiable, but the invisible labor that enabled that output remained largely uncounted. This idea of women's work as a support system often meant it was not seen as generating independent value. Instead, its value was tied directly to its utility in facilitating male productivity. It was a means to an end, not an end in itself. If a man's farm prospered, it was his hard work and skill that received credit, even though the efficient management of the household, the careful preservation of food, and the creation of essential goods by his wife were equally critical to the family's economic stability. The household was a complex economic unit, and the woman was its central manager and primary producer of many essential goods and services. But her efforts were often subsumed under the umbrella of the male head of household's overall success. Work done outside the home, particularly that which involved direct production for trade or required physical strength in agriculture or warfare, was seen as real work deserving of public recognition and often leading to political. Work done inside the home, even if it involved equally complex skills and equally demanding physical effort, was categorized as domestic maintenance, a necessary background function that enabled the real work to take place. This implicitly suggested that women's labor was secondary, less important, and less valuable. Archaeological records often show a division of tools along gender lines in early medieval settlements, with heavier agricultural tools associated with male burials and domestic implements, like spindle whorls, with female burials, vision whorl. Consequences of this silent support system mindset were profound. It meant that women's contributions, however vital, were not recognized as an independent source of wealth or status. It ensured that women's economic agency remained limited, as their labor was perpetually tied to the success and activities of male family members. The entire edifice of society in 800 AD rested on the immense, often invisible, foundational work of women in the home. But this work was largely unheralded, seen not as a pillar of strength, but merely as the quiet ground upon which the male-driven world could operate. Number 4. Property and personhood. Legal disadvantage. Imagine a world where your tireless efforts, your immense productive capacity, and your vital contributions to a household did not translate into personal ownership, independent wealth, or recognized legal standing. In 800 AD, for many women, the legal framework profoundly impacted the perceived value of their domestic labor, effectively disconnecting their work from their personal economic power. While the specific legal rights of women varied across different regions of Europe in this period, from the more liberal customs of some Germanic tribes to the increasingly restrictive influences of Christian canon law and Roman legal traditions, a common thread was the general limitation on women's ability to own, control, and inherit property independently, which in turn devalued their labor. In many early medieval societies, women were often considered under the legal guardianship of a male relative, first their father, then their husband, and sometimes even their brothers or sons if widowed. This guardianship, known as mund in some Germanic laws, meant that a woman often could not enter into contracts, buy or sell property, or conduct legal proceedings without the consent or representation of her male guardian, while a woman might bring dowry or mourning gift into a marriage. Assets often given to her by her family or her husband upon marriage. The control of these assets typically passed to her husband upon marriage. She might have the right to use them, or they might revert to her family upon her husband's death. But direct, independent control over significant property was often limited. Legal codes from the Carolingian period, for example, often detail property rights, primarily through the male line, implicitly reinforcing the male head of household as the primary economic actor. This limited legal control over property directly impacted the valuation of a woman's domestic labor. If a woman spent years meticulously managing a household's resources, producing goods like valuable textiles or raising livestock, her efforts generated wealth for the household as a whole. However, that wealth was typically considered the property of her husband as the head of the household. She might labor for decades, spinning and weaving the finest wool into sought-after cloths, or mastering the art of preserving food for long winters, thereby significantly increasing the household's material worth and ensuring its survival. Yet the literal product of her hands and her accumulated knowledge might not be something she could legally sell, inherit, or bequeath independently. Her labor contributed to the husband's estate, not necessarily to her own independent wealth or capital. This absence of direct legal recognition for her productive labor as her own property diminished its perceived value in the broader economic sphere. The work she performed was for the collective benefit of the family unit, under the legal umbrella of the male head. This was not the same as a male artisan, who upon creating a product owned it and could sell it, thereby accumulating personal wealth or property. A woman's entire life might be spent in productive domestic labor, yet this labor often did not translate into personal economic power or individual legal standing in the same way. Charters and deeds from the era when they mention women often do so in relation to their male kin, underscoring their dependent legal status. Furthermore, in matters of inheritance, while daughters could inherit property, their portion was often less than that of sons, or it might be passed through a male relative. If a woman was widowed, her rights to her husband's property varied widely, but were often conditional on her remaining unmarried or on her raising male heirs. This uncertainty around property rights meant that the fruits of her domestic labor, which sustained the household, were always subject to male control or external legal stipulations, rather than being an assured personal asset. This lack of independent economic leverage meant that her productive work, however vital, did not contribute to her personal power or agency in a way that would elevate its public recognition. The profound societal impact was that women, despite being central economic producers within the household, were often relegated to a secondary legal and economic status. Their labor was essential, but it did not typically build personal capital or confer direct economic power in the way that male-dominated labor outside the home might. The very framework of the law, which often placed women under male guardianship and limited their independent property rights, implicitly communicated that their domestic contributions were not truly their own to control or profit from. This legal disadvantage ensured that women's immense household work, however indispensable, remained largely undervalued in the broader economic and social landscape of 800 AD. Number 3. The burden of perpetuity. Endless cycles of labor. Imagine a job where there's never a moment of true completion, no finished project to admire, no definitive end to the to-do list. Tasks simply reset every day, every week, every season in an unending cycle that demands constant, diligent effort. This was the fundamental nature of women's domestic work in 800 AD, and this inherent perpetuity contributed significantly to its undervaluing. Because the labor was never truly done in a way that could be quantified or celebrated, it became a background hum, an assumed constant, rather than a series of productive, finite achievements. Think about the daily grind. Every morning, women were responsible for reviving the fire, preparing the morning meal, ensuring water was fetched, and beginning the day's production. There was always food to prepare for the next meal, clothes to mend, floors to sweep, children to tend. As soon as one meal was cooked and eaten, the dishes needed cleaning, and preparations for the next began. As soon as a garment was finished, another would be worn out, or a child would outgrow their clothing, requiring new creation. There was no weekend from these chores, no designated time off. The demands of the household were constant, from dawn until dusk, and often into the night, with tasks like spinning by lamplight. Daily life chronicles, even from aristocratic households of the period, reveal a relentless schedule for women, underscoring this unending cycle. Beyond the daily tasks, there were relentless seasonal cycles. Spring brought the need for intense cleaning after winter, planting small gardens, and preparing for lambing or calving. Summer demanded extensive food, preservation, drying, salting, smoking, to ensure survival through the leaner months. Autumn was a time of harvesting and preparing for winter, involving massive amounts of food processing and storing. Winter meant more time indoors, often dedicated to the intensive creation of textiles, spinning, weaving, and sewing, to replenish clothing and bedding. These seasonal shifts didn't provide a break. They simply shifted the focus of the unending work. The annual rhythms of life reinforced the perpetual nature of these domestic duties, making them seem like an eternal recurrence rather than a series of distinct, productive campaigns. The very nature of this cyclical, unending labor meant that its output was rarely seen as a discrete product in the same way that a crafted object might be. A blacksmith completed a tool, a carpenter finished a building. These were tangible, finite accomplishments that could be admired, sold, and counted. But how do you quantify the constant effort of keeping a home clean, feeding a family 3 times a day, or endlessly mending clothes? It was a continuous process of maintenance and renewal, a constant fight against entropy, rather than a clear trajectory towards a completed goal. This made it difficult to assign a tangible value to the work, as it lacked the clear beginning and end points that typically define a valued economic activity. Archaeological evidence showing the consistent presence of domestic tools in layers of settlements over centuries further illustrates the unchanging and continuous nature of these tasks. Moreover, the repetitive nature of many of these tasks often led to them being perceived as tedious or simple despite the skill and endurance they required. Spinning, for example, was an incredibly time-consuming and repetitive task. Grinding grain was physically demanding and monotonous. Yet, because these were repetitive and constantly needed to be done, they were often viewed as less complex or valuable than tasks that resulted in a single, novel output. The sheer monotony and endlessness of the work could lead to it being taken for granted by others within the household and by society at large. If it's always being done, and always needs to be done again, it simply becomes part of the background rather than an extraordinary effort. This relentless, continuous demand for labor also left little room for women to engage in activities outside the immediate needs of the household that might have garnered more public recognition or economic agency. While some women might have participated in local markets or assisted with broader agricultural work, the sheer volume of daily recurring domestic tasks ensured that their primary focus remained squarely within the confines of the home. This perpetuation of labor, this constant turning of the domestic wheel, meant that women's contributions, though essential for survival, were often absorbed into the very rhythm of life, becoming so deeply ingrained in Cecily that their true value was consistently overlooked. Number 2. Skill without status, the The domestic arts. Imagine mastering an array of complex crafts, from chemistry to medicine, from agriculture to construction, all without the benefit of formal titles, public recognition, or societal prestige. In 800 AD, women were the primary practitioners of a vast and intricate suite of domestic arts that were in essence highly skilled trades. Yet, because these proficiencies were applied within the home and largely for the benefit of the family unit, they rarely conferred the same status, economic value, or public respect as male-dominated crafts practiced in the public sphere. This fundamental disconnect between the high level of skill involved and the low social status of the work was a major factor in its undervaluing. Consider the role of the woman as a master of textile production. This wasn't just sewing. It encompassed an entire industry within the home. As detailed previously, this involved the skilled preparation of raw materials like wool or flax, including cleaning, carding, and combing. Then came the incredibly precise and laborious art of spinning, turning raw fibers into usable threads of varying fineness. After spinning, there was the intricate knowledge of dyeing, which required understanding of natural mordants, plant properties, and chemical reactions to achieve desired colors. Finally, the act of weaving itself was a highly skilled craft, demanding dexterity, mathematical precision for patterns, and physical endurance to operate the loom. A woman proficient in all these stages was, in essence, a master craftswoman, overseeing a complex production line from raw material to finished garment. Yet, she was not seen as a weaver or a dyer, in the same professional sense as a male craftsman creating items for sale in the market. Her output was primarily consumed within the home, making her skill invisible to the wider economy. Archaeological finds consistently yield evidence of this pervasive textile production, but the skills are rarely explicitly lauded in written records as craftsmanship. Beyond textiles, consider the woman as a master of food science and preservation. Without refrigeration or modern canning methods, keeping a family fed through harsh winters required immense knowledge and skill. This included knowing how to cure meats, salt fish, make cheese, ferment grains for ale or mead, and dry fruits and vegetables. These were complex chemical processes, demanding precise timing, temperature control, and a deep understanding of spoilage. A mistake could mean sickness or starvation for the family. Similarly, baking bread, a staple of the diet, was an art form requiring an understanding of yeast, flour types, and oven temperatures. This was far from simple cooking. It was sophisticated food processing and engineering performed daily. Women were also the primary healthcare providers. Their knowledge of herbal remedies, wound care, and nursing techniques made them the first and often only recourse for illness and injury. They possessed a practical understanding of anatomy, symptoms, and the properties of countless plants. This was a form of folk medicine passed down through generations, and it was absolutely vital for family survival in an era without professional doctors or hospitals. A skilled healer within the home held immense power over life and death, but this expertise was not granted the same respect or formal recognition as a male monastic physician, for example, whose knowledge derived from written texts and public learning. Legal codes of the era, while sometimes mentioning remedies, generally do not formalize or credit female domestic healing roles. The management of a household was also a highly skilled logistical operation. This involved budgeting resources, organizing labor, maintaining property, and making countless daily decisions that impacted the family's survival and comfort. This was a complex managerial role, requiring foresight, adaptability, and leadership. Yet, it was simply seen as housekeeping, rather than an executive function. The sheer breadth of skills expected from a woman in 800 and encompassing aspects of agriculture, chemistry, medicine, engineering, management, and various crafts was staggering. The problem lay in the sphere of application. These skills, however sophisticated, were primarily applied within the domestic realm, for the family's direct consumption rather than for public exchange or economic profit in a formal market. This internal consumption kept the value of the work hidden. The lack of public market engagement meant no public valuation, no guild recognition, no professional titles. A man's skill as a blacksmith resulted in tangible, exchangeable goods and a recognized social role. A woman's equally complex skill as a weaver resulted in clothes for her family, and her role was simply wife or mother. This fundamental difference in how skills were applied and acknowledged was crucial in creating a situation where immense expertise existed, but largely without status, ensuring its constant undervaluing. Number 1. The invisible economy of the hearth. Imagine a bustling economy existing right beneath your nose, producing virtually everything a society needed to survive. Yet it operated without wages, without formal accounting, and largely outside the recognized systems of trade and commerce. This was the invisible economy of the hearth in 800, predominantly powered by women's labor. Because the vast majority of goods and services produced by women within the home were consumed directly by the household and did not enter a formal market where they could be assigned a monetary value. Their work was effectively rendered economically invisible, leading to its profound undervaluation. In 800, as self-sufficiency was not an ideal. It was a necessity for most households. There were no supermarkets, no department stores, and no easy way to purchase everything needed for daily life. Consequently, the home was not just a living space, it was a primary production unit. Women were the core of this production. They processed raw agricultural products into edible food, turning grain into flour and bread, milk into cheese and butter, livestock into preserved meats. They transformed raw wool or flax into spun threads, then into weaved cloth, and finally into all the necessary garments for the entire family. They brewed ale, collected firewood, raised poultry, tended small gardens, and performed countless other tasks that provided for the family's material needs. Each of these activities prevented the household from having to buy these goods, saving valuable, often scarce resources. Historians who study medieval household accounts, even from later periods that might offer some insight, often remark on the sheer scope of goods produced internally, highlighting this pervasive domestic economy. The critical distinction here is the lack of monetary compensation. A male farmer might sell surplus grain in a local market, earning coins or other forms of exchange. A male craftsman might sell his pottery or metalwork for silver. This exchange, this transaction, assigned a clear economic value to their labor. For women, their work within the home, however vital, was generally unpaid. It was considered part of their expected contribution to the family unit, part of the implicit social contract of marriage and household life. There were no wages for cooking, no salaries for spinning, no payment for childcare. This absence of direct monetary exchange meant that the enormous economic value created by women's hands and skills was never formally tallied or recognized as wealth in the same way. It was simply absorbed into the family's subsistence. This lack of monetary exchange made the work economically invisible in a larger sense. When economists today calculate a country's gross domestic product, they count goods and services that are bought and sold. The work performed within a household, unpaid and unmeasured, typically falls outside these calculations. In 800 AD, this informal, unmeasured economy was arguably the largest sector of production, yet it was completely unrepresented in any societal accounting of wealth or productivity. Imagine trying to assess the economic strength of a village if you completely ignored the output of every single household's female members. You would get a profoundly incomplete and misleading picture. The economic contributions of women were a foundational layer of the entire societal structure, yet they were treated as if they didn't exist in any quantifiable economic sense. Archaeological discoveries of entire complexes of domestic production tools at early medieval sites underscore the widespread and intensive nature of this work. Yet the lack of associated monetary records prevents us from truly valuing its scale. Furthermore, because the products of women's labor were typically consumed within the household, they did not enter public markets in a way that would allow their value to be publicly debated or established. The durability of a homespun garment, the nutritional value of home-baked bread, or the efficacy of home-brewed medicine were evident to the family, but they didn't generate prices or profit margins that could be compared and understood across the wider economy. This kept the economic significance of women's work confined to the private sphere, preventing it from being recognized as a major contributor to the broader societal wealth. The invisibility of this economy also permeated societal attitudes. Because the work wasn't paid or publicly traded, it was often assumed to be less valuable than work that did generate currency. This created a profound psychological and social undervaluing. The tireless efforts that ensured a family was fed, clothed, and sheltered were seen as background maintenance, a natural part of domesticity, rather than a demanding economic contribution. This perception was so deeply embedded that it is rarely even mentioned in contemporary chronicles, which focus on the visible male-dominated aspects of economic and political life. The immense, uncompensated labor of women in the home was the silent engine of early medieval society, its indispensable contributions the very bedrock of survival, yet profoundly unacknowledged and undervalued because it operated entirely within the invisible economy of the hearth.